It had been a long time since Chelsea had won their only trophy, the 1955 First Division League Championship. It was about time they got back into the conversation. This is Chelsea and their first golden age.
Chelsea have won the cup.
Chelsea have won the European Cup Winners' Cup for the first time in the club's history, and Chelsea fans, please onto the pitch.
Chelsea were born in 1905, not in the borough of Chelsea, but in Fulham, where a team called Fulham FC played and were formed 26 years prior. Upon Chelsea's inception, they were coached by John Tate Robertson, who combined his playing career with the post, and so began the rich lineage of Chelsea being drawn to player managers. Robertson was an incredibly influential man to the sport, but only after he had departed the club when he arrived in Hungary in 1911. In his absence, Chelsea would flip-flop between Divisions 2 and 1 before finally finding a spot of solidity with their promotion back to the top flight in 1930. An entertaining enough team in their day, Chelsea languished in mid-table in the interwar years and after the Second World War was over. This despite the efforts of Billy Burrell, who was hired as manager prior to the war with the plan that the club needed to produce their own talent instead of purchasing other people's, a facet of Chelsea that slightly faded from view recently. They were a far cry from the team of their time, Herbert Chapman's Arsenal, but it would be a product from that incredible team that would introduce Chelsea to footballing success, and he went by the name of Ted Drake. On firm but mid-table foundations, Drake conducted a root and branch review of Chelsea Football Club. He wanted the Stamford Bridge faithful to be more hostile, so opposing players would fear playing there. Aesthetically, he revitalised the club badge, introducing us to the Chelsea Lion, which still remains in place to this day. It didn't work immediately. They came as close as ever to relegation in his first ever season before rebounding with the club's finest league finish in 34 years in 8th. Still languishing in mid-table between Burnley and Charlton Athletic, still a way off the pace of Wolves, the heir apparent Chapman's Arsenal, and it appeared to be going in a similar trajectory for the 1954-55 season. Until before Christmas, Chelsea started to win and win convincingly. The perpetually successful managers of their day, Arthur Rowe of Spurs and Stan Cullis of Wolves, both fell in 1954's last weeks, before one defeat in their final 3 months etched a new name onto the First Division's lineage, Chelsea. It should never have been allowed to be a one-time thing, especially with Burrell's passion of youth development coming through the ranks, fronted by the majestic Jimmy Greaves. Forced to withdraw from the inaugural edition of the European Cup by narrow-minded Football League chief Alan Hardaker, Chelsea flounced back to mid-table, conceding an astounding 289 league goals in Drake's final 3 years. What could have been Chelsea striding out confidently into a new age of European football was just a fleeting flash in the pan. And what's more, they now had to find a new manager. Tommy Docherty was brought to London by Arsenal in what was a dreadful time during their club's history. After being pimped out to British clubs all over 1961, Docherty stipulated that he wouldn't leave the capital, hence a player-coach role under Ted Drake across town at Stamford Bridge. He'd turn out just 4 times for the Blues, but would take on extreme importance and responsibility as autumn 1961 came around in what had become rapidly a disastrous campaign. Chelsea had sold Jimmy Greaves, were bottom in the league and were relying on youngster Bobby Tamblyn, another product of Billy Burrell's academy plans, to drag them out of the mess. Unable to steer them clear of the drop, Docherty's Chelsea finished rock bottom on 28 points in a campaign where even Fulham managed to stay up by the skin of their teeth. The Blues would be back, and quite quickly too. With the signing of Frank Upton from Derby County and the increased importance of his centre-half partner John Mortimer, Chelsea posted the meanest defensive numbers in the second division. They went up ahead of Sunderland on goal average in a campaign elongated by the Big Freeze of '63. It wouldn't be the last time that Tommy Docherty would foster big club optimism after promotion back to the big time. Chelsea were back, they were energetic, they were primed, Docherty was at the heart of it. A 5th place finish was all primed to be that springboard. Stamford Bridge had ambition again. That arrived in material form during the summer of '64 when £150,000 was slapped down to rebuild the West Stand. Regardless, the stadium would remain a joke and remain a thorn in the side of not only Docherty but his many successors. One defeat from the last 9 league matches of the prior campaign became unbeaten in the first 10 of this season, a run only ended by the eventual champions Manchester United in late September 1964. This was a team built on a young core, players like Peter Bonetti, Alan Harris, Terry Venables, Bert Murray, Bobby Tamblyn and Ron Harris, who had won the FA Youth Cups of 1960 and 61. Another backbone who would come synonymous with Chelsea was Eddie McCready, picked up for the ludicrous fee of £5,000 and the effort of travelling to East Stirling for a friendly match. Ultimately, it was a season of a first title challenge in a decade that was never going to pay off, what with the enormous weight of Matt Busby's return to league success after the Munich air disaster. And of course a small matter of Docherty's diamonds, as they were labelled, breaking curfew in a trip to Blackpool with the club top of the league in April 1965. They'd be humiliated by Burnley 6-2 before returning to the scene of the crime to lose at Blackpool as they limped out of the season. Nonetheless, it wasn't Chelsea's only avenue for potential success in the 1964-65 season. There was the FA Cup after all, and an almighty occasion at Villa Park in a semi-final with Bill Shankly's Liverpool.
Stevenson scores. Liverpool win 2-0.
Alright, but that was wedged in between 2 legs of the League Cup final, and Chelsea were favourites against the '63 FA Cup finalists of Leicester City. And finally, silverware again. Chelsea were good, but the problem was they knew it. They liked the smell of their own farts a bit too much, and their overindulgent football combined with football on 3 fronts led to a season of malaise thereafter. They opted not to defend their League Cup crown thanks to a European campaign that took them to Rome, Milan and Munich before a semi-final replay defeat in Barcelona. They lost another semi-final in the FA Cup, going down to Sheffield Wednesday, again 2-0 and again at Villa Park. Combined with a turgid 5th place in the league, Docherty decided to renew the squad. Terry Venables was the highest profile victim, out of the squad and sold to Spurs to make room for Charlie Cook from Dundee. That summer, chairman Joe Mears died of a heart attack in Oslo, ensuring that the club was, for the first time, out of the Mears name as change enveloped Chelsea both on and off the pitch. And the '67 vintage of Chelsea were everything that you wanted in a team. Again, they started the league season 10 unbeaten. John Hollins, Marvin Hinton and Tommy Baldwin had all become important cogs in the team. So too Peter Osgood, and it was a League Cup match against Blackpool in October in which the whole season turned. A game drawn 1-1 rendered meaningless when Osgood broke his leg. They'd lose the replay end 1966 winless in 8 as they were removed from the top of the tree and plummeted down into 5th place, just in time for the FA Cup to kick in. Huddersfield Town and, after a replay, Brighton fell before both Steel City clubs were vanquished in order to confirm another Villa Park semi-final, this time against Leeds. A rare goal from transfer flop Tony Hateley took Chelsea to Wembley for their first major cup final, where they'd meet Tottenham Hotspur, ever so slightly removed from their pomp at the start of the 60s to render the 1967 FA Cup final a toss of the coin affair.
Robertson was perfect for the rebound. From Robertson's header, Frank Saul shot into the net. And a goal. Boyle centred, Tambling headed in. Cup winners' medals were waiting up there for Tottenham Hotspur. And once again, the last hurdle had proved too much for Chelsea.
And Chelsea were officially over. Tommy Docherty departed the club in October, more so after off-field battles than those on it. He fought with John Hollins over the players' pay throughout the summer before his demise was swift after he was found to be racially abusing a Bermudan FA official during a tour. After shipping 5 at Newcastle, 6 at home to Southampton and being dangerously close to relegation anyway, the time was right. A transition fell to Old Trafford basically 10 years to the day in the future. Chelsea decided to run away from the Tommy Docherty era of entertainment into the methodical arms of Dave Sexton. Previously a coach at the club, he'd got his managerial career off to an inauspicious start with Leyton Orient, a club he left in the lurches of a relegation down to Division 3. Some departure then to be suddenly managing Chelsea. The club turned their nose up with greater form either side of Christmas 1967 before another tilt at a trophy was quashed by Birmingham City away in the FA Cup quarter-finals that March. Nonetheless, 6th place in the league, a solid enough start for the new manager who had been parachuted in mid-season. Sexton's plan was to add guile into the team. David Webb moved up from Southampton, John Dempsey poached from Fulham for £70,000 before Ian Hutchinson came in for just £5,000 from Cambridge. Initially a fullback, Hutchinson would be turned into a prolific forward and therefore turned into one of the biggest bargains in Chelsea history. Andrei Shevchenko this was not. His first full season was characteristic of the man really, a crushingly sensible improvement of 2 points and 1 place, combined with another cup quarter-final falter into another Midlands opposition. Alternatively, a European campaign in the Fairs Cup would be halted, dead in its tracks after defeating the second round to Dutch team DWS courtesy of a coin toss. In the second season of the Sexton era, 1969-70, the Blues limped out of the blocks sluggishly. If they weren't being unnecessarily held to teams of the calibre of Southampton, Crystal Palace, Wolves and Sunderland, they were getting beaten away at Anfield, Upton Park and Elland Road. A glut of injuries necessitated Ian Hutchinson's move to centre forward for an elongated spell in the squad, and after yet another match was thrown in at home to Brian Clough's Derby County that October, Chelsea could now start to improve. Peter Osgood was moved from midfield and joined Hutchinson in attack. The two built a great strike partnership, Hutchinson the physical force, Osgood the incessant runner, and instantly the next 4 matches were won and no league defeat in 3 months. And by the time the FA Cup swung back around, Chelsea had surged up into a spot on the podium behind Everton and Leeds United, both the runaway contenders for the title. In the third round of the Cup, Birmingham City had dispatched comfortably this time, and Burnley were going the same way as Chelsea led by 2 with 21 minutes to go. Then, just as at home to both Burnley and Wolves earlier on in the league season, they shipped 2 late goals. This game though was due for a replay up at Turf Moor. This time Chelsea bagged themselves a late equaliser through Peter Houseman before they ran away with the 5th round place in extra time. The remainder of the cup run would be played out entirely in the capital, although none of the matches would be contested at Stamford Bridge. In both Crystal Palace and QPR, Chelsea found useful opposition who could only contain them for half of a football match before the Blues ran away with both 5th and 6th round ties. Then in a stroke of luck, Chelsea avoided both Manchester United and Leeds United and looked out on a team polluting the bottom half of the second tier in Watford. A similar narrative played out level at half-time until Chelsea ran away with proceedings, winning 5-1 at White Hart Lane. 4 weeks later they'd meet Leeds at Wembley in the thin hope of third time lucky after previous FA Cup finals had been lost, first of which at Old Trafford in 1915 against Sheffield United, second of which we've already shown you. In Leeds, Chelsea were supposed to receive a knackered opponent because Leeds were going through 2 legs of a European Cup semi-final against Jockstein's Celtic. Then again, thanks to the FA, everyone was knackered because the season had been condensed to allow for preparations ahead of the World Cup in Mexico. Whilst Leeds were stumbling over the finish line as part of an attempt to treble, Chelsea sat a place behind them, ambling through meaningless games with no chance of catching them or the eventual champions, Harry Catterick's Everton. Chelsea had to make do without Alan Hudson in midfield, meaning Tommy Baldwin would be utilised out of position. Both teams would have to make do with the right mess the Horse of the Year show had created. Wembley was set for the final, but with a pitch more accustomed to the Unibond League.
Aim towards Jack Charlton. Kick. No, it's a goal! It's gone to Houseman with a shot. And a goal! Oh, terrible mistake there! Jones, a goal! Nick Jones, 2-1. Ends to curl it in again. Hutchinson, a goal! By Ian Hutchinson! There goes the whistle for the end of extra time. And for the first time since 1912, the FA Cup needs a replay.
Peter Bernetti had kept Chelsea in the cup, providing a man-of-the-match display at the start of what would be a bittersweet summer for the goalkeeper of England. Plenty of cup finals had been drawn, most recently in 65 and 68, but on those occasions it had been settled in extra time. In fact, there hadn't been an FA Cup final replay since 1912, when Barnsley and West Brom moved from Crystal Palace to Bramall Lane long before Wembley had been built. 58 years on, the replay would be played 18 days later and away from the capital. It would be taken up north just as it had done in 1912 when the more northern team ultimately benefited. Now Chelsea had to traipse up to Old Trafford for the replay to meet quite possibly the greatest team in England at the time. The only thing on their side was that the playing surface wouldn't be as much of a mud bath.
And he's still going on for Jones to go! And there's the ball coming in, that's good! A wonderful goal! He leads box again just to see what that might produce. It's a good long one. Long again towards David Webb! And Chelsea are in the lead! For the long throw of Ian Hutchinson. Just listen to the reception they're getting from those Chelsea fans.
Eddie Gray, who gave Chelsea defenders the runaround at Wembley, was nullified this time by Ron Harris in a match which would become famous for two things. It was broadcast to almost 30 million people in Britain, and it was a nasty game by modern standards would have seen half the field sent off. It was Leeds after all. Come the 1970-71 campaign, Ian Hutchinson essentially carried his glut of form into this season, netting in the Charity Shield defeat to league champions Everton. Then he grabbed himself a double on the opening day at home to Derby County, only to break his arm in a 1-1 draw at the City Ground. After just 3 league goals, injuries would rob Hutchinson of his Chelsea career. After an inconsistent winter where Hutchinson returned to the goals at home to West Brom in January and away to Stoke, the very next game away at the Dell saw Hutchinson tear his knee cartilage. Back in the 70s, this spelled the end of his season and basically the beginning of the end of his career. Hutchinson's strike partner was hardly in the good books either, suffering an extremely harsh, lengthy 8-week ban for a series of yellow cards. He'd not scored in the league in 1971 yet, as John Hollins and Alan Hudson took on the goal-scoring mantle for a miserable Chelsea. The club though simply had to march on, regardless. And what better way to do so than in a return to European action? Club Brugge had outclassed Chelsea in Belgium, and Sexton's side returned to Stamford Bridge without a clean sheet and a 2-goal deficit. That depression continued through a losing trip to White Hart Lane and a mind-bogglingly bad goalless draw at home to Huddersfield Town a week later. Not the ideal preparation for what would become known as the first great European night under the Stamford Bridge lights, as the Blues ran out 4-0 winners after extra time. Spurs had won the League Cup, Arsenal were busy eloping to only the second ever league and FA Cup double of the 20th century, and so this should have been the fuel to Chelsea's fire as they entered the spring. Peter Osgood had returned to the pitch and the goals, and the Cup Winners' Cup semi-final draw brought them even more fire. They'd be met with some familiar foes, Manchester City. And it was easy, too easy. Either way, Athens was all set for May 19th, 1971, and Chelsea would finally be a European finalist. They'd be meeting the ultimate European finalist, Real Madrid, who saved their place thanks to a Piri goal 8 minutes from time at home to PSV Eindhoven. Champions of Europe 6 times, fair enough, it had been 5 years since their last continental triumph, and players like Gento, Di Stefano and Puskas were now just hazy memories of a bygone era. If ever there was a time Chelsea could meet Real Madrid as equals, it was now. A match that played out without broadcast in the UK criminally, except for the extra time period on BBC Radio, because the more important England vs Wales home championship clash came on the very same night. 1971 was a very long time ago. The replay, unlike the FA Cup the prior year, would be turned around almost immediately, exactly 48 hours in the same stadium. So Chelsea did what English footballers did after an intense game. They got absolutely arseholed. There'd be outcry these days, but in 1971...
And Dempsey has scored! Number 8, Baldwin. Osgood. he scored! Austin has done it! It's over! The whistle has gone! Chelsea have won the European Cup Winners' Cup for the first time in the club's history, and Chelsea fans race onto the pitch.
England was conquered, partially, and now Europe was conquered, again, partially, not in the top competition. But Chelsea were here, the 1970s were in full swing, and seemingly nothing could stop them from being a force in England and on the continent.
Turned in again, and now Greenhoff looking for it in the front row. Delicate chip there, a deep one towards Richie, not it down again, and a good save, and he's Stoke have won, to the delight of their bench and their supporters.
The decline set in with the League Cup final defeat to Stoke, Chelsea's last major cup final for 22 years. In the post-season, Chelsea's oncoming demise was telegraphed by the demolition of the East Stand. Now Stamford Bridge had become a building site. It truly was a scruffy stadium, far cry from all the pomp of the King's Road. Now you could see a graveyard beyond the foundations of the old stand, a sign of things to come. The subsequent season began well, but an autumn days fell into a shock exit from the League Cup semi-finals to Norwich City. Nor could they stop Arsenal's charge to a third successive FA Cup final as the Gunners shot Chelsea down after a replay in the quarter-final. 12th became 17th in the league, and after no joy in the Cups and a player revolt, Dave Sexton was gone. He'd put both Osgood and Alan Hudson on the transfer list in January 1974 for being bad influences, i.e. getting face when they weren't supposed to. This would become known as the moment the wheels were put in motion for Chelsea's relegation. The 1975 relegation was all but confirmed when Chelsea went away and lost at White Hart Lane 2-0 on April the 19th. That was the afternoon the club was plunged into the drop zone and, with 2 matches left, were doomed. A point back on Spurs, Chelsea would go down with Luton Town and Carlisle United after Ron Stewart couldn't correct the course as manager and Eddie McCready was given the feckless task of returning the Blues to the top flight. He'd achieved that in 2 years' time, but that's a story for another day. The golden age of Chelsea was earned by combining 2 key historical facets to the club's foundation. Firstly, they spent wildly more than anybody in England in the 10 years between Tommy Docherty's hiring in 1961 and the Cup Winners' Cup triumph of 1971. But in that 1.25 million came only a net spend of 10 grand. That is because Chelsea had been handed a blueprint by Billy Burrell during the Second World War that they should harness their own youth products. In winning the FA Youth Cups of the early 60s, the club was able to source profit from Jimmy Greaves and Terry Venables whilst keeping club legends Bobby Tamblyn, Alan Hudson and Peter Osgood around. The entertainment of the Docherty era bled seamlessly into the sensible successors of Dave Sexton, built upon a foundation of industry. Adapting Ian Hutchinson from fullback to centre forward proved a masterstroke, as did the unsung hero of Peter Houseman. He was transformed into a pivotal match-winning winger under Sexton, but continued to suffer abuse from his own crowd merely for not being George Best. As Best tanked his career in a blaze, Houseman was prolonging the 1970 FA Cup run with a 4th round replay goal against Burnley and netting in the second leg against Club Bruges a year later, 2 goals that spurred Chelsea on for their best pre-Roman Abramovich successors. It truly was the first Chelsea golden age. They might not have won the title as a previous team had done in 55, but they had won every available cup to them, most impressively in Europe. And admittedly, they were still the poorer cousin of Arsenal across town. And speaking of Arsenal, we have released an issue of videos on the Gunners, which you can check out here.